Buckle up for this one, folks, because we are diving into a real historical head-scratcher today. We're talking Brazil, 1934, the state of Paraná, to be exact.
Paraná.
And they're grappling with this, well, kind of a big decision. Should they accept Assyrian refugees? You'd think, right? On the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward humanitarian thing to do.
Yeah, you'd think. But
there's a twist.
Oh, yeah. A big one. Get this. The most organized opposition to these refugees. It wasn't some, angry mob on the street. It was the Instituto de Ordem dos Advogados do Paraná.
The what now?
Basically, think of it like their version of a bar association, lawyers, legal professionals. And we're going deep into their yearbook from that year, 1934. And you won't believe this, a huge part of it is dedicated to this whole anti-immigration campaign. Like, they were chronicling their own, almost like a case study against letting these people in.
Okay, hold up. So we've got legal professionals, the folks who are supposed to be all about fairness and justice, leading a charge that, let's be honest, would probably raise a lot of eyebrows today. It seems a little, contradictory, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. We're using this book. It's called Campanha contra imigração dos Assírios, and it's basically our guidebook to figuring out, why did Brazil say no to these refugees? What was going on?
Right. It's like we've got this historical mystery on our hands. We've got the clues. We've got the suspects. Let's crack this thing wide open. But to really get into their heads, I think we need to, zoom out for a second. Think big picture.
Yeah.
It's the aftermath of World War I. The world is in chaos.
Yeah.
You've got the League of Nations trying to find homes for all these displaced people. And Brazil, with all its land and resources, it looks like a pretty good option on paper, right?
You would think, right. On the surface, it seems like a good fit.
But telling a nation, hey, you should take in a bunch of foreigners, it doesn't always go over so well.
No, not always, especially when you've got a nation that's still figuring out its own identity. Imagine someone coming into your house and trying to redecorate when you haven't even finished unpacking from a move.
Yeah, I can see how that wouldn't go over too well. So we've got this clash, right? On the one hand, this international pressure to be humanitarian, to help out.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, Brazil's trying to figure out, who are we? What do we want to be? It's like a teenager trying to assert their independence, but on a national scale.
Absolutely. And all those anxieties, those fears, they really jump out at you when you read this book. It's like they poured all their worries onto the page.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. What were people in Paraná actually saying about these Assyrian refugees? What were their arguments against letting them in?
Well, money talks, right? And economic fears were huge. The speeches in this book are just full of worries about job competition, especially since the global economy was, a bit shaky at the time. They're going to take our jobs. It's not a new phrase. Apparently, it's been around forever.
Yeah, it's like that fear is just hardwired into us, right? When times get tough, point the finger at the outsider.
Unfortunately, yeah. It seems like a pretty common human reaction.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about economics, though. They were also deeply concerned about, I guess you could call it, maintaining a Brazilian identity. They worried that all these Assyrians coming in would disrupt the social harmony and maybe even lead to conflict.
So it was like this fear of the other, right? The unknown coming in and changing the familiar, even if that change might be for the better in the long run.
Exactly. And this is where things get, a bit more troubling. Some speakers, like this guy, Dr. Ulysses Vieira, he went so far as to worry about the weakening of the Brazilian race. Now, keep in mind, the way they understood race back then was totally different.
Yeah, that's a perspective that's hard to swallow today. But it really highlights how much their fears were wrapped up in this idea of national purity, even though Brazil was already this melting pot of different cultures.
Oh, for sure.
Were there other speakers that kind of echoed these concerns?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One of the most outspoken critics of immigration was Dr. Hostilio de Araujo. He was all about Brazil being self-sufficient. He's like, we don't need outsiders. We can take care of ourselves. Very much a go-it-alone kind of attitude.
Man, that go-it-alone sentiment, it's almost like a preview of all those nationalistic movements we see popping up around the world today.
It really is. It's like this recurring theme throughout history, this fear of the outsider. But what I find particularly fascinating is how Dr. Lindolfo Pessoa, the president of the Institute at the time, he was pretty savvy. He used a brand new technology to amplify these fears: the radio.
The radio.
Yeah, he gave this powerful address, and it's actually included in the book. He's talking about the need for selective immigration, basically saying we need to carefully control who gets in to preserve our social harmony.
So not only was he like tech savvy, he understood how to shape public opinion. It's like the 1930s version of a viral social media campaign.
It really is. And it was incredibly effective. His use of radio really mobilized public opinion against the Assyrians. It shows that these concerns weren't just some fringe idea, they were really resonating with a lot of people.
So they were hitting all the emotional buttons, right? Economic anxiety, fear of social change, this sense of us versus them. But I've got to imagine not everyone in Paraná was on board with just shutting out these refugees, right? Where they're dissenting voices, even within the Institute itself.
You're totally right to ask that. What's so cool about this book is that it actually shows us those dissenting voices. Remember, it's a collection of speeches and documents, so we get a glimpse behind the curtain, so to speak. And it turns out some members actually saw this Assyrian immigration as a potential positive thing. Like, hey, maybe this could be good for the economy. Maybe this could lead to some interesting cultural exchange. They actually had to be convinced to join the No campaign.
Wow, so even within this one organization, you had this internal struggle, this debate. It's like they were wrestling with the soul of Brazil. You know, what kind of nation did they want to be?
Exactly. And it wasn't this simple black and white situation. There were valid points on both sides reflecting these very different visions for Brazil's future.
It's wild how much this one book, Campanha contra Imigrados Assírios, really captures this tug of war, between different visions for what Brazil could be. Like, it was bigger than just the Assyrians. It was about, well, the whole future as a nation.
Oh, absolutely. And remember, this internal debate happening within the Institute, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. Like, we got to remember, the League of Nations is out there actively pushing for Brazil to, open its doors, right? They're seeing this humanitarian crisis unfolding, and they're thinking, Brazil, you guys have the space, you could be part of the solution.
But Brazil, as we've seen, they weren't really into being told what to do.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to something as, well, sensitive as immigration. It's like, who wants to be told who they can and can't invite to their own party?
Exactly. And this is where things get really, really interesting. Because on one hand, you've got this, idealistic organization, the League of Nations. They're all about international cooperation, a more humane world.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you've got Brazil, this young nation trying to find its own way, assert its independence.
This is clash of worldviews almost. You've got the global versus the national, the humanitarian impulse bumping up against this, self-preservation instinct. Must created some serious tension.
Oh, totally it did. And it's something we still grapple with today, right? How do we balance those responsibilities? The responsibility to those in need, but also to protect our own interests, our own identities. Tough questions.
No easy answers for sure. But going back to the 1930s, I'm curious about, the everyday people in Paraná.
Yeah.
How did this play out for them? Did they feel this tension? Were they debating this stuff?
Oh, they were totally debating it. Imagine picking up the newspaper and seeing these fiery editorials denouncing Assyrian immigration, or turning on the radio and it's Dr. Pessoa's voice booming through the speakers talking about protecting Brazil from this, perceived threat.
Man, it sounds like the 1930s version of a social media war. Just everybody sharing articles, arguing, trying to win people over to their side.
It was a battle for hearts and minds, for sure. And remember, these weren't just abstract debates. They had real consequences for real people. Imagine being an Assyrian refugee, right? You've survived all this hardship, and then you come face to face with this wall of hostility.
Yeah, it's pretty heartbreaking to think about. Reminds us that behind all the politics, the arguments, the rhetoric, there are actual human beings whose lives are being affected.
100%. We have to remember that. But getting back to the campaign itself, it wasn't just speeches and editorials, right? You also had these public meetings, rallies, even protests.
So a full-on, multi-pronged effort to win over the public and, I guess, pressure the government to reject the Assyrians.
Exactly. And ultimately, they were successful. The Brazilian government, facing all this pressure, they caved. They refused to accept the refugees.
So the campaign got what it wanted in the short term. But like we've been talking about, I think the impact went way beyond that one decision.
Oh, without a doubt. And one of the biggest legacies of this whole thing, I think, is how it shaped the way people talked about immigration. It's like by tapping into these really deep-seated fears and anxieties, they gave legitimacy to a certain way of thinking about immigrants. This idea that immigrants are a threat, they're a burden, they're dangerous to Brazilian identity.
It's almost like they planted this seed of fear and suspicion that just kept growing, influencing attitudes toward immigration for years to come. Pretty sobering thought.
It is, but it's also a powerful reminder of how much words matter, how the stories we tell ourselves can shape the way we see the world and the decisions we make.
This has been an amazing look at a really, really complex and honestly, at times, pretty uncomfortable chapter of Brazilian history. But before we wrap up part 2 here, I'd love to get your thoughts on why this particular campaign, this story from the 1930s, why it's still relevant today.
What blows me away is how much this resonates with debates we're having right now about immigration. Like the things they were saying against the Assyrians back then, the economic anxieties, the cultural fears, this whole us versus them mentality. It's like we're hearing echoes of that in different parts of the world today.
Yeah, it's like history is giving us this warning sign, showing us how easily these fears and prejudices can resurface, often with really devastating consequences.
It's definitely a cautionary tale, but it's also, I think, a call to action. By understanding where these attitudes come from, we can be more aware of them, challenge them when we see them popping up. We can work to create a more inclusive world, a world that embraces diversity rather than fearing it.
That's a powerful message and a great place to pause for now. We've covered a ton, but there's still more to unpack.
Welcome back, folks. It's amazing how this campaign from the 1930s, all laid out in Campanha contra imigração dos Assyrios. It's like this crash course in, the ups and downs of immigration debates. It feels so relevant even today.
It really does.
But before we totally close the book on this case, I'm curious about the ripple effects, the lasting impact. Like, did this rejection of Assyrian refugees have any consequences down the line for Brazil?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, actions have consequences. It's tough to say, oh, because of this one event, this specific law was passed later. But it's like, think of it like dropping a dye tablet in a glass of water.
Okay. You can't unmix it, right? The color spreads.
Yeah.
And I think, this campaign definitely contributed to a social and political climate that wasn't exactly, welcoming to immigrants in the years that followed.
So even though they sort of won in the short term, they might have accidentally made Brazil less open to newcomers in the long run. It's like they won the battle, but maybe lost the war for a more inclusive society.
That's a really, really good way to put it, yeah. And we see this happen a lot in history. You've got a small group driven by fear, and their actions end up having these huge unintended consequences.
I like that butterfly effect thing, right? One little flap of the wings can cause a hurricane on the other side of the planet.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we can't just look at history as these isolated events. We got to zoom out, see the big picture, understand how they shape things down the line.
So how do we apply that to our own lives? We're not dealing with a refugee crisis in our backyard, but these themes, fear, prejudice, othering, they're still around us.
That's why studying history is so crucial, I think. It's like this giant warning system. It's saying, hey, look, humans have been down this road before, and it rarely ends well. We can see how those anxieties about the economy, about cultural change, even just plain old prejudice, they were all used to justify shutting the door on the Assyrians. And sadly, we see those same tactics used today against other groups, immigrants, refugees, minorities, you name it.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're not just passively watching history unfold, We're part of it. We have to be more aware, more engaged.
100%. And that starts with understanding our own biases. We all have them, whether we realize it or not. This book, even with its, problematic content, it's a reminder of how easily fear can be twisted, exploited. We got to be critical thinkers, especially with complex issues like immigration.
So it's bigger than just understanding this one event, right? It's about equipping ourselves to be better citizens, more thoughtful, more engaged.
I couldn't agree more. This specific campaign might be in the past, but the lessons are timeless. We see how these anxieties played out then, and that helps us recognize them, challenge them when they pop up today.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. But it's not just about remembering, it's about understanding, analyzing, and applying those lessons, making the world a better place because of it.
Well, this has been such an eye-opening look at a part of Brazilian history I knew nothing about. History is way more than just dusty textbooks. It's about understanding the forces that shaped our world and how we can learn from them.
And sometimes the most unexpected sources can reveal the most profound truths.
To all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've come away with a new perspective, something to think about, and maybe even a little inspiration to make the world a more welcoming place.
Keep diving deep, folks, and never stop questioning the world around you.